The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets of Chicago into rivers of neon reflections and discarded dreams. It was the kind of November night that made people want to stay home, wrapped in blankets with hot chocolate and familiar faces on television screens. But Sophie Morgan didn't have that luxury. She never did. The diner where she worked, a 24-hour establishment called the Midnight Rose, didn't close for rain, snow, or the collective exhaustion of its employees. And Sophie, at 28 years old, had learned long ago that survival didn't pause for bad weather or aching feet. She stood behind the counter, wiping down the same spot for the third time, her mind elsewhere. The fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with that persistent electric hum that had become the soundtrack to her life. 3 years ago, she had stood in a different kind of light, the warm glow of a culinary school kitchen in New York, where her instructors had told her she had real talent, real potential. But potential didn't pay for her younger brother's medical bills when he was diagnosed with a chronic condition that required treatments their insurance barely covered. Potential didn't keep the lights on in their small apartment in Pilsen. So she had packed up her dreams, returned to Chicago, and traded her chef's jacket for a stained apron and the privilege of serving drunk businessmen at 3 in the morning. Tonight was particularly slow. The storm had kept most people away, and the few customers who had braved the weather had already left, leaving behind sticky tips and half-eaten plates of food that would end up in the trash. Sophie glanced at the clock. 2:15 in the morning. Just another hour and 45 minutes until her shift ended. Just another night in a long succession of nights that all blurred together into one endless stretch of exhaustion. That's when the door opened. The wind pushed it in with such force that it slammed against the wall, and Sophie jumped, her heart racing. A man stood in the doorway, rain pouring off him in sheets, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. But despite being soaked to the bone, there was something about him that commanded attention. His suit, even drenched, looked expensive, tailored to perfection. His posture was straight, almost military in its precision. And his eyes, those eyes that immediately found hers across the empty diner, were the color of steel and just as cold. He didn't say anything. He simply walked to the counter, water pooling beneath his Italian leather shoes with each step, and sat down on one of the red vinyl stools. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. There was something unsettling about this man, something that made her instincts scream that this wasn't a normal customer looking for coffee and a late-night burger. "Can I get you something?" she finally asked, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he continued to look at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was being studied, evaluated, measured against some invisible standard. His gaze traveled from her face down to her hands, still holding the damp dishcloth, and back up again. Sophie felt heat rising to her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and something else she couldn't quite name. "Coffee," he said finally, his voice low and rough, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Not foreign, but refined, educated, the kind of voice that belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, not in a greasy diner on the South Side at 2 in the morning. Sophie turned to pour the coffee, grateful for the excuse to break eye contact. Her hands were shaking slightly as she filled the white ceramic mug, and she silently cursed herself for the weakness. She had dealt with all kinds of customers over the years, from the aggressive drunks to the creepy loners who lingered too long. Why was this man getting under her skin? She placed the coffee in front of him, along with a small container of cream and a few sugar packets. He didn't touch it. He just kept watching her, and Sophie realized with a start that she couldn't look away either. There was something magnetic about him, something that pulled at her despite every rational part of her brain telling her to be careful. "What's your name?" he asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Sophie," she answered, then immediately regretted it. She never gave her real name to customers, always used something generic like Sarah or Jessica. But something about this man had stripped away her usual defenses. "Sophie," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded on his tongue. "Beautiful name. French origin. It means wisdom." "I know what it means," Sophie said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "My mother was a literature teacher." "Was? She passed away when I was 16. He nodded slowly, something flickering in those cold eyes. Sympathy, recognition? Sophie couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," he said, and surprisingly it sounded genuine. They fell into silence again, but this time it felt different, less oppressive. Sophie busied herself with cleaning up the kitchen area, but she was hyper-aware of his presence, of how he sat perfectly still, barely touching his coffee, just watching. Minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 3 o'clock. Outside, the rain continued to pound against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound that isolated them from the rest of the world. "Why are you here?" Sophie finally asked, turning to face him. "Really?" "Because you don't look like someone who needs a cup of bad coffee at 3 in the morning. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first real expression she had seen from him. "Maybe I needed to meet you." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to laugh, trying to break the strange tension. "That's a line if I've ever heard one." "It's not a line," he said, his voice serious again. "It's the truth." Before Sophie could respond, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, the kind of expensive stationery that Sophie had only seen in movies. He placed it on the counter between them, his hand lingering on it for a moment before he pulled back. "What is this?" Sophie asked, staring at the envelope as if it might explode. "An opportunity," he said. "Open it." Sophie hesitated, every instinct telling her not to, telling her to push the envelope back across the counter and tell this strange man to leave. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait that had led to so many downfalls throughout history, won out. She picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands, and carefully opened it. Inside was a document, several pages printed on the same expensive paper as the envelope. Sophie's eyes scanned the first page, trying to make sense of the legal language, but certain words jumped out at her, impossible to miss. Contract 7 days. Compensation $50,000. Act as legal spouse. Public appearances. No physical intimacy required unless mutually agreed upon. Sophie looked up at him, her mouth dry. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "No joke," he said calmly. "It's exactly what it says. I need someone to pose as my wife for 1 week. 7 days. You would accompany me to business dinners, social events, and 1 charity gala. In return, you would receive $50,000, paid in full at the end of the week, regardless of how the arrangement concludes." Sophie set the papers down on the counter, her hands shaking now for an entirely different reason. "You're insane. You walk in here a complete stranger and expect me to agree to something like this. I don't even know your name." "Dominic," he said. Dominic Blackwell. The name meant nothing to Sophie, but clearly it was supposed to. He watched her face for recognition and seemed almost pleased when he didn't find it. "You really don't know who I am," he said, more to himself than to her. "Should I?" Sophie asked, crossing her arms defensively. "Most people in Chicago would. My family owns Blackwell Industries. We specialize in commercial real estate development, with interests in several other sectors. I'm the CEO." Sophie's mind raced. She had heard of Blackwell Industries. Everyone in Chicago had. Their name was on buildings all over the city, those sleek glass towers that reached toward the sky like monuments to wealth and power. And this man sitting in her diner at 3 in the morning, soaking wet and offering her an insane contract, was the CEO of that empire. "Why me?" Sophie asked, the question bursting out of her before she could stop it. "If you're really who you say you are, you could hire anyone. Models, actresses, professional escorts. Why come to a diner in the middle of the night and pick a random waitress?" Dominic was quiet for a moment, and Sophie saw something shift in his expression, a crack in that perfect, controlled facade. "Because you're not part of that world," he said finally. "Because when I walked in here tonight and you looked at me, you didn't see Dominic Blackwell, CEO and heir to a fortune. You just saw a man in a wetsuit. That's what I need. Someone real. Someone who won't be recognized in the circles I move in. Someone who won't have connections to my competitors or hidden agendas. And someone desperate enough to say yes," Sophie added bitterly. He didn't deny it. "I'm offering you a solution to your problems, Sophie. You work 60-hour weeks in this place, and I'm guessing you're still barely making ends meet. Do you have medical bills? I can see it in the way you carry yourself. That weight of responsibility that comes with caring for someone who's sick. This money could change your life." Sophie felt anger flare in her chest. You don't know anything about me or my life. I know enough, Dominic said. I know you're educated, probably college, maybe culinary school based on the way you handle yourself in a kitchen. I know you're working here because you have to, not because you want to. I know you're scared of being stuck in this life forever, watching your dreams get smaller and smaller until they disappear completely. The accuracy of his assessment stunned Sophie into silence. How could this stranger see so clearly into her life, into her fears? It felt violating and oddly comforting at the same time to be seen so completely by someone. I need an answer soon, Dominic said, glancing at his watch. It was a Patek Philippe, Sophie noticed, probably worth more than she made in a year. The first event is in 3 days. That would give us time for you to be fitted for appropriate clothing and to learn the basics of what you need to know about my business and my family. 3 days? Sophie's voice came out as a squeak. You're asking me to completely upend my life in 3 days? I'm asking you to take a chance, Dominic corrected. 1 week, Sophie. 7 days that could solve your immediate financial problems and give you the freedom to figure out what you really want from your life. After that, we go our separate ways and you never have to see me again. Sophie looked down at the contract again, her eyes catching on the number. $50,000. She did quick math in her head. That would cover Tyler's medical bills for the next year, with enough left over to pay off her credit card debt and maybe, just maybe, put a little aside to restart her culinary dreams. It was more money than she had ever imagined having at one time. But it was also insane. Completely, utterly insane. She didn't know this man. For all she knew, this could be some elaborate scheme, a way to lure her into something dangerous. The logical part of her brain, the part that had kept her safe and careful for so many years, was screaming at her to refuse, to tear up the contract and tell him to leave. But there was another part of her, a part that had been dormant for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. The part that had once dreamed big dreams, that had believed in possibilities and second chances. That part was whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to break free from the cycle of exhaustion and despair that had become her life. I need to think about it, Sophie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic nodded, as if he had expected this response. He stood up, pulling a business card from his wallet and placing it next to the envelope. My private number is on there. Call me by tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. If I don't hear from you by then, I'll assume the answer is no, and I'll find someone else. He turned to leave, and Sophie felt a sudden panic rise in her chest. Wait, she called out. Why now? Why tonight? You could have approached me any time, had your people contact me. Why show up here like this? Dominic paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He turned back to look at her, and for the first time Sophie saw something vulnerable in his expression, something almost human beneath the cold exterior. Because I needed to see if you were real, he said. And because I don't have as much time as I thought I did. Before Sophie could ask what he meant, he was gone, disappearing into the rain-soaked night as suddenly as he had appeared. The door swung shut behind him, and Sophie was left alone in the diner, the envelope and business card sitting on the counter like evidence of a dream. She looked at the clock. 3:30. Her shift would end soon, and she would go home to their small apartment, where Tyler would be sleeping, probably having fallen asleep with his laptop still on, watching videos to distract himself from the pain in his legs. She would quietly check on him, make sure he had taken his evening medication, and then collapse into her own bed for a few hours of fitful sleep before starting the cycle all over again, or she could make a different choice. Sophie picked up the contract and read through it more carefully this time. The language was straightforward, almost surprisingly so for a legal document. 7 days, starting this coming Friday and ending the following Friday. She would be required to attend 4 specific events: a business dinner, a cocktail reception at the Chicago Art Institute, a private yacht party on Lake Michigan, and a charity gala. She would be introduced as his wife and would be expected to act accordingly in public, but the contract was explicit that no physical intimacy was required or expected unless both parties agreed. All clothing and accessories would be provided. She would be compensated $5,000 upon signing, and the remaining $45,000 upon completion of the 7 days. It seemed too good to be true. And Sophie had learned long ago that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But as she stood there in the empty diner, the fluorescent lights buzzing above her and the rain pounding against the windows, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just this once, the universe was offering her a way out. She folded the contract carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then slipped it into her apron pocket, along with the business card. She would go home, get some sleep, and think about it with a clear head in the morning. That was the rational thing to do. But even as she made this decision, Sophie knew that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The careful, cautious woman who had walked into work tonight was gone, replaced by someone who was willing to consider the impossible. Someone who was tired of playing it safe and watching life pass her by. When her replacement arrived at 4, Sophie clocked out and walked to the bus stop, the envelope feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in her pocket. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the city was quiet in that particular way it only got in the hours before dawn. As she waited for the bus, Sophie pulled out her phone and did what any rational person would do. She Googled Dominic Blackwell. The images that came up took her breath away. There he was, the same man who had sat at her counter just an hour ago but transformed by context. In these photos, he was wearing tuxedos and perfectly tailored suits, standing next to governors and senators, cutting ribbons at building openings, shaking hands with other impossibly wealthy and powerful people. He was consistently described as one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors, a billionaire who had taken over his family company at 32 after his father's retirement and had grown it exponentially in the 5 years since. There were also articles speculating about his personal life, wondering why he hadn't settled down, linking him romantically to various women who all seemed to be models or heiresses or actresses. But there was never anything confirmed, never any long-term relationships acknowledged. Dominic Blackwell, it seemed, was a man who kept his private life very private. The bus arrived and Sophie got on, sinking into a seat near the back. As the city rolled past the windows, all those sleeping buildings and darkened streets, she thought about what Dominic had said. About needing someone real, someone who didn't belong to his world. About not having as much time as he thought. By the time Sophie reached her apartment building in Pilsen, the sun was just starting to hint at its arrival, painting the eastern sky in shades of grey and pink. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, her legs aching from the long shift, and quietly let herself in. Tyler was asleep on the couch, his laptop balanced precariously on his chest, earbuds still in his ears. At 23, he should have been in his last year of college, maybe thinking about graduate school or starting his career. Instead, he spent his days managing his condition, going to physical therapy appointments, and trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life while his body fought against him. Sophie gently removed the laptop and earbuds, covered him with a blanket, and stood there for a moment, watching him sleep. This was why she did everything. This was why she had given up her dreams and worked herself to exhaustion. Because Tyler was all the family she had left, and she would do anything to take care of him, including possibly pretending to be the wife of a billionaire for a week. Sophie went to her room and pulled out the contract again, spreading it out on her bed. She read every word, every clause, looking for the catch, the hidden trap that would explain why this was too good to be true. But it wasn't there. The contract was straightforward, almost aggressively so. 7 days, $50,000. Act as his wife in public. No physical intimacy required. She thought about calling him right then, telling him yes before she could change her mind. But it was 5 in the morning, and even billionaire CEOs probably slept. Besides, she needed to be sure. This wasn't a decision to make while exhausted and emotional. Sophie set an alarm for noon and forced herself to sleep. When she woke up, groggy and disoriented, the first thing she did was check her phone to make sure she hadn't dreamed the whole thing. But no, the business card was still there on her nightstand, Dominic Blackwell printed in elegant script with a phone number beneath it. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of her daily routine. She made breakfast for Tyler, helped him with his morning stretches, drove him to his physical therapy appointment. The whole time her mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios, weighing pros and cons, trying to logic her way to a decision. "You okay, Soph?" Tyler asked on the drive home from therapy. "You seem distracted." Just tired, Sophie lied. Long shift last night. But Tyler knew her too. Well, it's more than that. You've got that look you used to get when you were working on a really complicated recipe, like you're trying to figure out if all the ingredients will work together. Sophie couldn't help but smile. Her brother had always been perceptive, even as a kid. Just thinking about some stuff, she said vaguely. Nothing to worry about. That night, Sophie stood in front of her bathroom mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in months. When had she gotten so tired looking? When had the shadows under her eyes become permanent fixtures? When had she stopped seeing herself as a person with dreams and potential, and started seeing herself as just a vessel for exhaustion? At 8:30, she picked up her phone. She had been telling herself all day that she would make a rational decision, that she would weigh all the factors carefully. But in the end, it wasn't logic that made her dial Dominic's number. It was something more fundamental, more desperate. It was the need to believe that her life could be different, that she deserved more than grinding poverty and endless sacrifice. He answered on the second ring. Sophie. Just her name, but the way he said it made her heart race. She took a deep breath. I'll do it, she said. I'll be your wife for 7 days. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sophie wondered if he had been expecting her to say no. Good, he said finally, and she could hear something like relief in his voice. I'll have my assistant contact you tomorrow with details. You'll need to take the week off from work. That's not going to be easy, Sophie said. I can't just disappear for a week. I'll make sure you're compensated for any lost wages, Dominic said. And Sophie? Thank you. You won't regret this. But as Sophie hung up the phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that she already did. Or maybe what she felt wasn't regret but fear. Fear of what she had just agreed to. Fear of stepping into a world she didn't understand. Fear of this man who had walked into her life like a storm and offered her everything she needed most. Fear of what might happen when the 7 days were over and she had to go back to being just Sophie again the next morning. Arrived with the kind of cruel brightness that only comes after sleepless nights. Sophie had barely closed her eyes, her mind spinning with what she had agreed to, replaying the conversation with Dominic over and over until the words lost all meaning. At 7:30, her phone rang, startling her out of the half-sleep she had finally managed to fall into. An unknown number flashed on the screen, and Sophie's heart jumped into her throat as she answered. Miss Morgan? This is Catherine Wheeler, Mr. Blackwell's executive assistant. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, with the kind of efficiency that came from years of managing impossible schedules and demanding bosses. Mr. Blackwell has asked me to coordinate your preparations for the coming week. Are you available to meet this afternoon at 2 o'clock? Sophie sat up in bed, her mind still foggy. I have to work tonight at 6. That won't be necessary, Catherine said smoothly. Mr. Blackwell has already spoken with your employer. You've been granted a 2-week leave of absence with full pay. Consider it handled. 2 weeks. But the contract says 7 days. 1 week for preparation, 1 week for the actual arrangement, Catherine explained. Mr. Blackwell is very particular about details. He wants to ensure you're completely comfortable and prepared before the first public appearance. Now can I confirm you for 2 o'clock today? Her car will pick you up at your residence. Sophie looked around her tiny bedroom with its peeling wallpaper and the water stain on the ceiling that the landlord kept promising to fix. The idea of someone from Dominic's world seeing how she lived made her stomach twist with embarrassment. I can meet you somewhere else. Just tell me where. Nonsense, Catherine said, and Sophie could hear the smile in her voice. The car will be there at 1:45. Please be ready. And Miss Morgan? Don't worry, this is going to be quite an adventure. After she hung up, Sophie sat in bed for a long moment, trying to process what was happening. Her life had been the same for so long, an endless loop of work and worry and exhaustion. Now, in less than 24 hours, everything was changing at a speed that made her dizzy. Tyler was already up when Sophie emerged from her room, sitting at their small kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and his laptop. He looked up at her with concern. You look terrible. Bad shift? Something like that, Sophie said, pouring herself coffee with shaking hands. She had been trying to figure out how to tell Tyler about the arrangement with Dominic. On one hand, she didn't want to worry him or make him feel guilty about the medical bills that had driven her to this decision. On the other hand, she couldn't just disappear for 2 weeks without an explanation. "Ty, I need to talk to you about something." Her brother's expression immediately shifted to worry. "Are you okay? Is it your job? Did something happen?" "No, nothing like that. Actually, something good happened, I think." Sophie sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug. "I got an opportunity, a temporary job, kind of like contract work that pays really well. But it means I'll be gone for the next 2 weeks. Tyler's eyebrows shot up. "Gone where? Doing what?" Sophie had rehearsed this in her head, trying to find a version of the truth that wouldn't sound completely insane. "It's a hospitality position. Very high-end for a private client. I'll be helping coordinate events, managing some social functions. It's the kind of thing that could lead to better opportunities in the future." It wasn't exactly a lie, she told herself. She would be attending events, and it could potentially lead to something better, even if she had no idea what that might be. "That sounds amazing, Soph," Tyler said, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "See? I told you something good would come along. You're too talented to be stuck in that diner forever." The guilt hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. Tyler believed in her so completely, so unconditionally. What would he think if he knew the truth? That she had agreed to pretend to be a stranger's wife for money? "I'll make sure you have everything you need while I'm gone," Sophie said quickly. "I'll stock the fridge, leave money for groceries and anything else. And you can call me anytime, okay?" "I'm 23, not 12, Tyler laughed. "I think I can manage 2 weeks without you hovering over me." "This is good, Sophie. Really good. You deserve something good." At 1:45 exactly, Sophie was standing outside their apartment building, wearing the best outfit she owned, a simple navy dress she had bought for a job interview 2 years ago. She felt ridiculous, overdressed for standing on a cracked sidewalk in Pilsen, but she didn't know what else to wear to meet with a billionaire's assistant. A black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, so sleek and expensive-looking that several neighbors stopped to stare. A driver in a crisp suit got out and opened the back door for her. "Miss Morgan, I'm Robert. I'll be driving you today." Sophie slid into the back seat, sinking into leather so soft it felt like butter. The car smelled like luxury, that indefinable scent of money and quality that she had only ever experienced in department stores she couldn't afford to shop in. As they pulled away from her building, Sophie watched her neighborhood disappear behind them, the familiar streets giving way to unfamiliar territory. They drove north, into the part of Chicago where the buildings got taller and shinier, where people walked with purpose and expensive coffee, where Sophie had always felt like an outsider. The car finally pulled up in front of a gleaming glass tower in the loop, and Robert opened her door. 30th floor, he said with a kind smile. "Catherine is expecting you." The elevator ride up felt like ascending into another world. When the doors opened on the 30th floor, Sophie stepped out into a reception area that was all white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows, with views of the city that took her breath away. A woman in her 40s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, approached with an extended hand. "Sophie, I'm Catherine. It's lovely to meet you." Her handshake was firm, confident, and her eyes assessed Sophie with the kind of quick, thorough evaluation that made Sophie feel like she was being scanned and catalogued. "Come with me. We have quite a bit to cover this afternoon." Catherine led her through a maze of hallways, past offices where people worked at computers with multiple screens, past conference rooms with tables that could seat 20 people. Everything was sleek, modern, expensive. Sophie had never felt more out of place in her life. They ended up in a private office that looked more like a luxury apartment than a workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a seating area with a couch that probably cost more than Sophie made in a year, and a desk that was completely clear except for a single laptop. "Please, sit," Catherine said, gesturing to the couch. She settled into the chair across from Sophie, crossing her legs elegantly. "I know this must all feel very overwhelming. Dominic told me you accepted the arrangement, but I want to make sure you understand exactly what you're agreeing to." "I read the contract," Sophie said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The contract covers the legal aspects," Catherine said, "but there's a lot it doesn't cover. The nuances of this world, the expectations, the social dynamics you'll be navigating. My job is to prepare you for that." Over the next hour, Catherine walked Sophie through what the next 2 weeks would look like. The first week would be intensive preparation. Sophie would meet with a stylist who would help her select appropriate clothing and accessories for each event. She would work with an etiquette coach to brush up on formal dining protocols and social graces. She would receive a briefing book on Dominic's business, his family history, and the key players in his social circle. And she would spend time with Dominic himself, learning how to interact naturally as a couple. The key, Catherine explained, is that this needs to appear completely authentic. The people you'll be meeting are sophisticated, observant, and many of them are looking for any weakness they can exploit. If they sense that this marriage isn't real, it could create problems for Dominic's business. What kind of problems? Sophie asked. Catherine hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Dominic's position is more precarious than it might appear from the outside. His father retired 5 years ago and left him in charge of Blackwell Industries, but there are board members and investors who have never fully accepted his leadership. They see him as too young, too unmarried, too unpredictable. There have been attempts to force him out, to reorganize the company in ways that would diminish his authority. And having a wife changes that? Having a wife suggests stability, maturity, someone who's ready to settle down and focus on building a legacy. It's ridiculous and outdated, but in the world of high-stakes business, perception is everything. Catherine leaned forward. Sophie, I want to be very clear with you. This arrangement is beneficial for you financially, yes, but it's also potentially risky. You'll be stepping into a spotlight that can be very unforgiving. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? Sophie thought about Tyler, about the medical bills that kept accumulating, about the dreams she had buried. I'm certain, she said. Catherine smiled. Good. Then let's begin. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of activity. A stylist named Marcus arrived, a flamboyant man in his 50s, who took one look at Sophie and clapped his hands together with delight. Oh, darling, you're gorgeous. Absolutely stunning. We're going to have so much fun with you. He measured her, took photographs from every angle, asked questions about her preferences and comfort levels. The goal, he explained, is to enhance who you are, not to create someone new. Dominic was very specific about that. He wants you to look like a polished, elegant version of yourself, not like you're playing dress-up. After Marcus left, a woman named Veronica arrived to discuss hair and makeup. She examined Sophie's face with the intensity of an artist studying a canvas, touching her skin, tilting her head in different directions to catch the light. Beautiful bone structure, she murmured. And your eyes, absolutely captivating. We'll keep everything natural, classic. You don't need anything dramatic. By the time Catherine walked Sophie back to the elevator at 6 o'clock, Sophie's head was spinning with information and instructions. Tomorrow at 10, Catherine said, we'll start working on your background story. The key to a successful deception is consistency. Every detail of how you and Dominic met, how long you've been together, why you decided to marry. It all needs to be memorized perfectly. This is really elaborate for just 7 days, Sophie said. Catherine's expression turned serious. In Dominic's world, 7 days can change everything. The people you'll be meeting, they're not just making small talk. They're gathering intelligence, looking for leverage. One inconsistency, one wrong detail, and the whole thing falls apart. That night, alone in her apartment after Tyler had gone to bed, Sophie sat with the information packet Catherine had given her. It was thick, easily 100 pages, filled with details about Dominic's life, his business, his family. She started reading, and with each page she realized just how little she actually knew about the man whose wife she was supposed to be. Dominic Blackwell, born in Chicago to Richard and Elizabeth Blackwell. Attended Princeton for undergraduate, Harvard for his MBA. Joined the family business at 25, became CEO at 32 when his father retired. Never married. Parents deceased. His mother from cancer when he was 28. His father from a heart attack 2 years ago, just months after retiring. No siblings. No close family except for an uncle, Richard's younger brother Marcus, who served on the board of directors and was reportedly one of Dominic's biggest critics. There were photos throughout the packet. Dominic at various charity events, always in immaculate suits, always with that same controlled expression. Dominic at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, shaking hands with politicians and other business leaders. Dominic alone, always alone, despite the mentions of various women he had been photographed with over the years. Sophie studied his face in these photos, trying to reconcile the powerful CEO with the man who had sat at her counter in the rain. There was something different about him in person, something the photos didn't capture. A vulnerability, maybe, or a weariness. She wondered what had driven him to create this elaborate arrangement. What was at stake that made it necessary? The next morning, Sophie returned to Blackwell Industries, this time with a better sense of what she was walking into. Catherine met her in the same office as before, but this time she wasn't alone. Dominic was there, standing by the windows, looking out at the city. He turned when Sophie entered, and she felt that same electric jolt she had experienced in the diner, that sense of connection that made no logical sense. "Sophie," he said, his voice warm. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." They settled on the couch and Catherine pulled out a laptop. "We're going to create your story today," she explained. "How you met, how the relationship developed, all the details that people will ask about." For the next 3 hours, they crafted a fiction that was close enough to reality to be believable, but polished enough to fit Dominic's world. In their story, they had met 6 months ago at a small restaurant where Sophie was working as a chef. Dominic had been there for a business dinner, and he had been so impressed by the food that he had asked to meet the chef. They had started talking, discovered a connection, and had been seeing each other quietly ever since. They had married in a small private ceremony 2 weeks ago, keeping it secret, because Dominic wanted to protect their privacy before making a public announcement. "Why the secrecy?" Sophie asked. "Won't people think that's strange?" "Actually, it fits perfectly with Dominic's personality," Catherine said. "He's known for being private about his personal life. People will understand wanting to keep the relationship out of the spotlight initially." As they refined the details, Sophie found herself watching Dominic. He was different today than he had been in the diner, more relaxed, more engaged. He asked her questions about her real life, seemed genuinely interested in her answers. When she mentioned Tyler, his expression softened. "Your brother's condition, is it being managed well?" he asked. "As well as it can be," Sophie said. "The treatments help, but they're expensive." Dominic nodded slowly. "The money from this arrangement, will it be enough?" "For now. For the next year, maybe longer if I'm careful. And after that?" Sophie shrugged, trying to appear casual. "I'll figure something out. I always do." Something flickered in Dominic's eyes, an emotion Sophie couldn't quite read. "You shouldn't have to just figure it out," he said quietly. "You should have better options." The intensity of his gaze made Sophie uncomfortable, and she looked away. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, nothing more. She couldn't afford to read anything into moments like this, couldn't let herself believe that Dominic's interest in her life was anything other than professional. Catherine cleared her throat. "We should discuss the physical aspects of the arrangement." Sophie's head snapped up. The contract said no physical intimacy was required. "And that's still true," Catherine said quickly. "But you will need to appear comfortable with each other physically. Holding hands, his arm around your waist, perhaps a kiss on the cheek or forehead in public. These are normal displays of affection between married couples, and their absence would be noticed." Dominic stood up and extended his hand to Sophie. "May I?" Sophie took his hand, and he pulled her gently to her feet. They stood facing each other, and Sophie was acutely aware of how close he was, how tall he seemed now that they were standing. Dominic's hand moved to her waist, settling there with a touch that was firm but not aggressive. "Like this," he said softly. "When we're at events, I'll guide you through crowds this way. It needs to look natural, comfortable." Sophie's heart was racing, and she hoped he couldn't feel it. His hand was warm through the fabric of her dress, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of cedar and rain. "Try putting your hand on my arm," Dominic instructed. "Yes, like that. When we're walking together, this is how we'll move." They practiced for a while, Catherine watching critically and offering suggestions. "Sophie, relax your shoulders. You're holding too much tension." "Dominic, soften your expression. You look like you're in a board meeting, not with your wife." After an hour of this strange choreography, Catherine finally called for a break. Sophie excused herself to use the restroom, needing a moment alone to collect herself. When she returned, she heard voices coming from the office. The door was slightly ajar, and she paused, not meaning to eavesdrop but unable to help herself. She's perfect for this, Catherine was saying. Natural, genuine, exactly what you said you needed. I know, Dominic replied, and there was something in his voice that made Sophie lean closer to the door. That's what worries me. Dominic, you can't start second-guessing this now. Everything is already in motion. I'm not second-guessing the arrangement. I'm second-guessing my ability to maintain appropriate boundaries. There was a pause and Sophie held her breath. She's not like the others, Dominic continued. The women I usually spend time with, they understand the rules of this world. They know it's all performance, all strategy. But Sophie, she's real. And I'm asking her to pretend to be something that I'm starting to wish was actually real. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. She shouldn't be hearing this. She should walk away, come back in a minute, and pretend she heard nothing. But her feet were frozen to the floor. That's dangerous territory, Catherine said, her voice concerned. You know the rules you set for yourself after Elizabeth. Elizabeth. That name wasn't in any of the briefing materials. Who was Elizabeth? I know the rules, Dominic said. And I know why I made them. But this is different. She's different. Different enough to risk everything you've built? Your position in the company, your reputation, your carefully maintained control. I don't know, Dominic said, and he sounded tired. I honestly don't know anymore. Sophie forced herself to walk away, her mind reeling. She went back to the restroom and splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection in the mirror. What had she gotten herself into? This was supposed to be simple. A business transaction, money for a performance. But clearly, there were layers to this situation that she didn't understand. Complications that went far deeper than she had imagined. When she returned to the office, both Dominic and Catherine had their professional masks back in place. They continued the coaching session as if nothing had happened, but Sophie couldn't shake the conversation she had overheard. Who was Elizabeth? And what had happened that made Dominic create such strict rules for himself? The rest of the week passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Sophie met with Marcus twice more for fittings, trying on dresses and gowns that cost more than her monthly rent. She worked with Veronica on hair and makeup, learning techniques to achieve a polished look without appearing overdone. She had sessions with an etiquette coach named Diane, who taught her which fork to use at formal dinners and how to make graceful small talk with people she had nothing in common with. And every day, she spent at least 2 hours with Dominic, rehearsing their story, practicing their public interactions, learning the rhythms of how they would move together as a couple. These sessions were the hardest. Being close to him, feeling his hands on her waist or his arm around her shoulders, it was starting to feel less like an act and more like something she looked forward to. She tried to remind herself that this was all pretend, that in 7 days it would be over, and she would go back to her regular life. But with each passing hour, that regular life seemed further away, and the fantasy they were creating seemed more and more real. On Friday afternoon, the day before their first public appearance, Catherine gave Sophie a garment bag containing the dress she would wear to the business dinner. Marcus outdid himself, she said with a smile. You're going to look stunning. That evening, alone in her apartment, Sophie unzipped the garment bag and gasped. The dress was midnight blue, made of silk that seemed to shimmer in the light. It was elegant but not ostentatious, with a neckline that was modest but flattering. There were shoes to match and a small clutch purse. She tried everything on, standing in front of her full-length mirror, and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her was sophisticated, polished, the kind of woman who belonged at a billionaire's side. But underneath the expensive clothes and professional styling, she was still just Sophie. Still the girl who worked in a diner, who worried about medical bills, who had given up her dreams to take care of her brother. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dominic. Tomorrow night everything changes. Are you ready? Sophie stared at the message for a long time before responding. As ready as I'll ever be. But even as she sent the text, she knew it was a lie. She wasn't ready. Not for the world she was about to enter, not for the role she was about to play, and definitely not for the feelings that were growing inside her every time Dominic looked. At her with those steel-gray eyes that seemed to see right through every defense she had ever built. The next evening would be her first test, her first real appearance as Mrs. Dominic Blackwell. And as she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, Sophie couldn't decide what terrified her more, the possibility that she would fail at the deception, or the possibility that she would succeed so well that she would forget it was a deception at all. She thought about the conversation she had overheard between Dominic and Catherine, about boundaries and rules and someone named Elizabeth. She thought about the way Dominic's expression changed when he looked at her, the way his carefully controlled facade seemed to crack just slightly. She thought about the money waiting for her at the end of the week, and about Tyler, and about all the logical reasons she had agreed to this arrangement. But mostly, she thought about how it felt when Dominic's hand rested on her waist, when he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. And she wondered if it was possible to pretend to be in love with someone without actually falling in love with them for real. The answer, she suspected, was no. But by then it would be too late. The contract was signed, the preparations were complete, and tomorrow night she would step into a world where nothing was quite what it seemed, including her own heart. Outside her window, the city lights of Chicago glowed against the night sky, each light representing a life, a story, a dream. Tomorrow, Sophie's story would change forever. Whether that change would lead to something beautiful or something devastating, only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the girl who had stood behind the counter at the Midnight Rose, serving coffee to drunk businessmen and dreaming of a different life, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who was about to discover just how thin the line between pretending and reality could be, and how easy it was to lose yourself in a role you were only supposed to be playing. Saturday arrived with the kind of nervous energy that made Sophie's hands shake as she tried to apply her eyeliner. She had practiced the techniques Veronica taught her a dozen times during the week, but today, with everything riding on her performance, her fingers refused to cooperate. Finally, she gave up and called the number Veronica had given her for emergencies. "Darling, of course I'll come over," Veronica said warmly. "That's what I'm here for. Big first night jitters are completely normal. I'll be there in 30 minutes. True to her word, Veronica arrived with a full makeup kit and an infectious calm that immediately soothed Sophie's nerves. As she worked, transforming Sophie's face with subtle touches of color and light, she talked about her own experiences working with nervous clients. "I once did makeup for a bride who was so terrified she threw up on her wedding dress 20 minutes before the ceremony," Veronica said with a laugh. "Trust me, honey, you're doing great. And between you and me, I've seen the way Mr. Blackwell looks at you during your coaching sessions. That man is absolutely smitten, contract or no contract." Sophie's heart did a little flip, but she forced herself to stay rational. "It's all an act, Veronica. That's literally what we're being paid to do." Veronica met her eyes in the mirror, her expression knowing. "Honey, I've been in this business for 20 years. I know the difference between acting and actual chemistry. What you two have, that's not something you can fake." Before Sophie could respond, there was a knock at the door. Tyler called out that he would get it, and Sophie heard his surprised voice greeting someone. A moment later, Catherine appeared in the doorway of Sophie's bedroom, looking immaculate as always in a tailored black suit. "Good. Veronica's here," Catherine said approvingly. "How are we feeling, Sophie?" "Terrified," Sophie admitted. "Good. That means you're taking this seriously." Catherine set down a jewelry box on Sophie's dresser. "These are on loan from Cartier. Don't lose them." Sophie opened the box and gasped. Inside was a diamond necklace that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls, with matching earrings that were probably worth more than Sophie would make in her entire lifetime. "I can't wear these," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. "What if something happens to them?" "That's what insurance is for," Catherine said practically. "Besides," Dominic insisted, "he said his wife should have the best." An hour later, Sophie stood in front of her mirror, barely recognizing herself. The midnight blue dress hugged her body in all the right places. The diamonds at her throat and ears caught every bit of light, and Veronica's makeup had transformed her face into something that belonged on a magazine cover. Her hair was styled in soft waves that cascaded over one shoulder, elegant but not overly formal. "You look like a princess," Tyler said from her doorway, his eyes wide. "Soph, you're gorgeous." Sophie turned to her brother suddenly, overwhelmed with emotion. "Ty, what if I mess this up? What if I say the wrong thing or use the wrong fork or trip and fall flat on my face?" Tyler wheeled his chair closer and took her hand. "Then you'll get back up and keep going, same as you always do. You're the strongest person I know, Sophie. You can handle anything." The car arrived at exactly 6:30. Robert opened the door for Sophie, and she slid into the back seat, her heart pounding. But she wasn't alone. Dominic was already there, and when he saw her, his expression transformed into something that took Sophie's breath away. "Sophie," he said, and his voice was rough with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you," Sophie managed, her cheeks flushing. "You look very handsome yourself." It was an understatement. Dominic was wearing a custom tuxedo that fit him like it had been painted on, and his dark hair was styled perfectly. But it was his eyes that caught Sophie's attention, the way they traced over her face with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. As Robert pulled away from her building, Dominic reached into his jacket pocket. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a small velvet box. Sophie's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a wedding ring, a simple platinum band with a row of diamonds that circled it completely. She was elegant, timeless, and absolutely perfect. "May I?" Dominic asked, taking the ring from the box. Sophie extended her left hand, and Dominic slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and Sophie wondered how he had known her size. As if reading her mind, Dominic smiled slightly. "I noticed you wear a ring on your right hand sometimes," he said. "I had Catherine get it sized while you were in one of your coaching sessions." The thoughtfulness of the gesture made Sophie's throat tight. This was supposed to be fake, just a performance. But the weight of the ring on her finger felt very real, and the way Dominic was looking at her made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with acting. "There's something I need to tell you before we arrive," Dominic said, his expression becoming serious. "Someone will be at this dinner tonight who might be difficult. Her name is Victoria Ashford. She's the daughter of one of my major investors, and we dated briefly about 3 years ago." Sophie felt a sharp pang of something that felt suspiciously like jealousy. "Dated how briefly?" 6 months. It ended badly. She wanted more than I was willing to give, and when I ended things, she made it her mission to undermine me professionally. Her father controls a significant portion of Blackwell Industries' financing, so I've had to maintain a civil relationship with her despite our history. "And you think she's going to be a problem tonight?" Dominic's jaw tightened. "I know she will be. Victoria doesn't handle rejection well, and the news of my marriage will infuriate her. She'll try to get under your skin, to make you doubt yourself or doubt me. I need you to be prepared for that." Sophie straightened her shoulders, feeling a surge of determination. "I can handle her." Dominic reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I know you can. But Sophie, if at any point tonight becomes too much, if you need a break or want to leave, just tell me. Your comfort and safety are more important than any business deal." The sincerity in his voice made Sophie's defenses crack just a little more. She squeezed his hand. "We're in this together, right? For the next 7 days, I'm your wife. And I take that seriously, even if it's just pretend." Something flickered in Dominic's eyes, an emotion so intense it made Sophie's breath catch. "Right," he said quietly. "Just pretend." The restaurant was in one of Chicago's most exclusive buildings, the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu, and where reservations had to be made months in advance. As Robert pulled up to the entrance, Sophie saw a small crowd of photographers waiting behind velvet ropes. "There will be photos," Dominic warned. "Just smile, stay close to me, and don't answer any questions." When Robert opened the door, the flash of cameras was blinding. Dominic stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand to Sophie. As she emerged from the car, she heard the photographers shouting questions. "Mr. Blackwell, who is your companion? Is this the mystery woman you've been seeing? Can you confirm the marriage rumors?" Dominic's arm slid around Sophie's waist, pulling her close against his side. The gesture was protective and possessive at the same time, and Sophie found herself leaning into him naturally. They walked through the gauntlet of cameras, Dominic nodding politely but saying nothing, until they reached the restaurant's entrance. Inside, the maitre d' greeted them with a warmth that suggested Dominic was a regular customer. "Mr. Blackwell, how wonderful to see you. And this must be the lovely Mrs. Blackwell we've heard so much about." Mrs. Blackwell, hearing it said aloud, made it feel suddenly, startlingly real. They were led to a private dining room on the top floor, where about 20 people were already mingling with champagne glasses. Sophie recognized some faces from the briefing materials Catherine had given her. Business leaders, investors, politicians, the kind of people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives over cocktails and small talk. The moment they entered, conversation stopped. Every eye in the room turned to them, and Sophie felt the weight of their collective scrutiny. But Dominic's hand on her waist was steady, grounding her. "Everyone," Dominic said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Sophie." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and congratulations. People surged forward to shake hands and offer well wishes, and Sophie found herself swept into a blur of faces and names. She smiled, thanked people graciously, and tried to remember everything Catherine had taught her about making a good first impression. An older man with silver hair and sharp eyes approached, extending his hand. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm James Chen, one of the board members at Blackwell Industries." This is quite a surprise. Dominic has always been so private about his personal life. "He wanted to protect our privacy," Sophie said, using the line they had rehearsed. "But we're ready to share our happiness now. And how long have you two been married?" 2 weeks, Sophie said, letting her hand rest on Dominic's arm in the way they had practiced. "We wanted to keep it intimate, just the two of us." James's eyes narrowed slightly. "No family? No friends?" "When you know it's right, you don't need a big production," Dominic interjected smoothly. "Sophie is all the family I need." The way he said it with such conviction made Sophie's heart squeeze. She looked up at him, and for a moment the rest of the room faded away. There was something in his eyes, something that looked almost like truth, and Sophie found herself wondering if he was still acting or if something had shifted between them. The moment was broken by a woman's voice, sharp and laced with venom. "Well, isn't this cozy? Dominic, you always did move fast when you wanted something." Sophie turned to see a woman approaching, and she knew immediately this must be Victoria Ashford. She was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that came from a lifetime of professional stylists and personal trainers. Her red dress was designer, her jewelry was real, and her smile was absolutely lethal. "Victoria," Dominic said, his voice carefully neutral, "I wasn't aware you would be attending tonight." "Daddy wanted me here," Victoria said, her eyes raking over Sophie with barely concealed disdain. "You know how he values family participation in important business matters. Unlike some people, we believe in including our loved ones." The dig was obvious, and Sophie felt Dominic tense beside her. Before he could respond, Sophie stepped forward, extending her hand with a warm smile. "You must be Victoria. Dominic has told me so much about you. It's wonderful to finally meet some of his old friends." The word "old" was deliberate, and Sophie saw it land. Victoria's smile became even more fake as she shook Sophie's hand with a grip that was just a touch too firm. "How fascinating," Victoria said. "And where exactly did you two meet? I don't recall seeing you at any of our usual social events." "We met at a restaurant," Sophie said, sticking to their rehearsed story. "I was working there as a chef, and Dominic came in for a business dinner. We started talking, and well, the rest is history." "A chef," Victoria repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of that profession. "How quaint. And you gave that up to marry Dominic?" "I gave up nothing," Sophie said, keeping her voice pleasant but firm. "I'm simply exploring new opportunities. Marriage doesn't mean abandoning who you are." Victoria's eyes flashed with irritation. She turned to Dominic. "We need to talk, privately. There are some board matters that require your immediate attention." "Tonight is a social occasion, not a board meeting," Dominic said coolly. "If there are business matters to discuss, schedule them through Catherine during office hours." "This can't wait." "Then it will have to." Dominic's arm tightened around Sophie's waist. "If you'll excuse us, Victoria, I'd like to introduce my wife to the rest of our guests." As they walked away, Sophie could feel Victoria's eyes boring into her back. "She really hates me," Sophie whispered to Dominic. "She hates that she doesn't have control over me anymore," Dominic corrected. "You handled her perfectly, by the way." The old friend's comment was brilliant. Sophie felt a flush of pride. Maybe she could do this after all. The rest of the cocktail hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Sophie found herself actually enjoying some of the conversations, particularly with a woman named Margaret, who ran a non-profit focused on culinary education for underprivileged youth. They talked about food and cooking, and for a few minutes, Sophie forgot to be nervous. When they finally sat down for dinner, Sophie found herself at a table with Dominic, James Chen and his wife, Victoria and her father Richard Ashford, and two other couples. The seating arrangement put Victoria directly across from Sophie, which she suspected was not an accident. The meal was exquisite, course after course of beautifully prepared food that reminded Sophie of why she had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. She was so focused on the food that she didn't notice Victoria watching her until the woman spoke. "You're very engaged with your meal," Victoria observed. "I suppose that's the chef in you. Most people at these events barely touch their food. Most people don't appreciate the artistry that goes into creating something this beautiful," Sophie replied. "Every dish tells a story if you know how to listen." Dominic's hand found Sophie's under the table, giving it a gentle squeeze. When she glanced at him, his eyes were warm with something that looked like admiration. "How poetic," Victoria said with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Dominic, does your wife know about your aversion to sentimentality? He's always been so practical, so logical. I can't imagine him appreciating culinary poetry." "People change," Dominic said simply. "Or perhaps they just need the right person to help them see things differently." The look he gave Sophie as he said this made her breath catch. There was something in his eyes that went beyond their rehearsed affection, something real and raw and just a little bit dangerous. Victoria noticed it too, and her expression hardened. "Speaking of change, Dominic, have you told your wife about Elizabeth?" The effect was immediate. Dominic's entire body went rigid, and the warmth in his eyes was replaced by ice so cold it made Sophie shiver. "That's not an appropriate topic for dinner conversation, Victoria." "Oh, I think Sophie has a right to know about the great love of your life," Victoria continued, her voice saccharine. "After all, she's wearing a wedding ring now. She should know what she's competing with." "Victoria, that's enough." Richard Ashford's voice was sharp, and he looked genuinely angry at his daughter. "This is neither the time nor the place." But Victoria wasn't finished. She turned to Sophie with a smile that was all teeth. Elizabeth was Dominic's fiancée. They were together for 3 years, planning a wedding, building a life, and then she died. A car accident, completely random, completely devastating. Dominic hasn't been the same since. Some of us wonder if he'll ever truly be capable of loving someone again. The silence at the table was deafening. Sophie looked at Dominic and saw pain etched into every line of his face, a vulnerability he had been so careful to keep hidden. Her heart broke for him, for the loss she hadn't known about, for the grief he clearly still carried. Without thinking, Sophie reached for his hand and held it tightly. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, speaking only to him, forgetting about everyone else at the table. "I can't imagine how painful that must have been." Dominic looked at her, and Sophie saw something crack in his expression. "It was a long time ago," he said, but his voice was rough with emotion. "Some wounds never fully heal," Sophie said softly. "We just learn to live with the scars." For a moment, they were the only two people in the room, connected by shared understanding and something deeper that Sophie couldn't quite name. Then Dominic squeezed her hand and turned to Victoria with an expression of cold fury. "What you just did was cruel and completely out of line," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will apologize to my wife and then you will leave this table." "I was just being honest," Victoria protested. She deserved to know the truth. "The truth is that you're bitter and vindictive, and you've just shown everyone here exactly why our relationship ended," Dominic said. "Apologize to Sophie now." Richard Ashford stood up, his face red. "Victoria, apologize and excuse yourself. We'll discuss your behavior later." Victoria looked around the table, seeing nothing but disapproval and disgust. Her facade cracked, revealing the hurt and anger beneath. "I'm sorry," she said to Sophie, the words forced. Then she stood and walked away, her head held high despite her humiliation. The rest of the dinner was subdued. People tried to resume normal conversation, but the incident had cast a pall over the evening. Sophie picked at her food, her mind reeling with what she had learned. Dominic had been engaged. He had loved someone deeply enough to plan a life with her, and then he had lost her in the most sudden, brutal way possible. It explained so much. The walls he had built around himself, the careful control he maintained, The contract that kept everything businesslike and emotionally safe. He had loved and lost, and he was terrified of going through that pain again. After dinner there was more mingling, but Dominic seemed eager to leave. They made their excuses, thanked their hosts and escaped to the car. Once they were safely inside with the privacy partition up, Dominic leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said. "You shouldn't have been subjected to that." "Don't apologize," Sophie said. "Victoria was way out of line, not you." Dominic opened his eyes and looked at her. "I should have told you about Elizabeth before tonight. It wasn't fair to blindside you like that." "You don't owe me explanations about your past," Sophie said gently. "This is a business arrangement, remember?" "Is it?" Dominic asked. And there was something in his voice that made Sophie's heart race. "Is that really all this is?" Sophie didn't know how to answer. The line between pretending and reality had been blurring all night, and now, sitting in the quiet darkness of the car with Dominic looking at her like she was something precious, she couldn't remember why that line had seemed so important to maintain. "I don't know anymore," she admitted quietly. Dominic reached out and touched her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "Elizabeth died 4 years ago," he said. "And for 4 years, I convinced myself that I would never feel anything for anyone ever again, that it was safer to be alone, to keep everyone at arm's length. I built my life around that belief, and now," Sophie whispered, "now I'm sitting here with a woman who agreed to pretend to be my wife for money, and all I can think about is how much I wish it wasn't pretend at all." Sophie's breath caught. This wasn't part of the script, wasn't part of the careful performance they had rehearsed. This was real, raw, terrifying in its honesty. "Dominic, we can't," Sophie said, but even as she said it, she was leaning toward him. "The contract, the arrangement, it's all supposed to be professional." "I know," Dominic said. "I know all the reasons why this is a terrible idea. I know that I should maintain boundaries, that I should keep this strictly business. But Sophie, when you stood up to Victoria tonight, when you defended me and held my hand and looked at me like I was worth protecting, I realized something." "What?" "That I'm falling for you. Actually, genuinely falling for you. And I think I have been since the moment I walked into that diner and saw you standing there like you belonged in my life." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "This is crazy. We barely know each other. This whole thing is based on a contract and a lie." "I know," Dominic said again, "but it doesn't feel like a lie when I'm with you. It feels like the only true thing in my entire carefully constructed life." He leaned closer, his hand still cupping her face, his eyes asking a question that Sophie desperately wanted to say yes to. But before she could make that decision, before she could close the distance between them and turn this fake marriage into something terrifyingly real, her phone buzzed in her clutch. Sophie pulled back, breaking the moment, and checked her phone. It was a text from Tyler. "Emergency, hospital, come now." All the warmth drained from Sophie's body, replaced by ice-cold fear. "I have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "Tyler's in the hospital." Dominic immediately shifted into action mode. He pressed the intercom button. "Robert, change of destination. We need to get to the nearest hospital as fast as possible." "Which hospital?" Robert asked. Sophie checked the text again. "Northwestern Memorial." The drive that should have taken 20 minutes took 12, with Robert navigating traffic with expert precision. Dominic held Sophie's hand the entire time, offering silent support as she fought to stay calm. When they arrived, Sophie jumped out of the car before it had fully stopped, running through the emergency room entrance in her evening gown and borrowed diamonds. At the reception desk, she gasped out Tyler's name, and the nurse directed her to the 3rd floor. Dominic was right behind her, his hand on her back as they rushed to the elevator. They found Tyler in a private room, looking pale but conscious. A doctor was checking his vitals, and when Tyler saw Sophie, he tried to smile. "I'm okay, Soph. I'm sorry I scared you." Sophie collapsed into the chair beside his bed, taking his hand. "What happened?" "His condition flared up," the doctor explained. "The pain became severe enough that he called 911. We've given him medication to manage the symptoms, and we want to keep him overnight for observation. But he should be fine." Sophie felt tears streaming down her face, a mixture of relief and exhaustion and fear that had been building all night. "You're sure he's okay?" "I'm sure," the doctor said kindly. He'll need to follow up with his regular physician, but there's no immediate danger. After the doctor left, Tyler looked past Sophie to Dominic, his eyes widening. Holy hell, Soph, is that who I think it is? Sophie had forgotten that Dominic was still there, standing quietly in the doorway in his tuxedo. She wiped her tears and made introductions. Tyler, this is Dominic Blackwell. Dominic, my brother Tyler. The contract guy? Tyler asked, his eyes going even wider. The temporary job is with Dominic Blackwell. Sophie winced. In her panic, she hadn't thought about what Tyler knowing might mean. But Dominic simply walked over and extended his hand. It's good to meet you, Tyler. Your sister talks about you constantly. She does? Tyler looked at Sophie, confused. But I thought this was just a business thing. It is, Sophie said quickly. At the same time, Dominic said, it's complicated. Tyler looked between them. And despite his pain and exhaustion, Sophie saw understanding dawn in his eyes. You two are actually together, aren't you? Like for real? Tyler, it's not like that, Sophie protested weakly. It's exactly like that, Dominic said quietly. Or at least I hope it could be. Sophie looked at him. This powerful man who was standing in a hospital room at midnight, who had rushed her here without hesitation, who was looking at her like she was the most important person in the world. And she realized that somewhere between the contract signing and tonight, between the coaching sessions and the rehearsed touches, she had fallen for him too. We should talk, Sophie said. But not here. Tyler needs to rest. I'm fine, Tyler insisted. And you two clearly need to figure some things out. Go talk, I'll be here when you get back. Dominic and Sophie walked to the hospital's quiet waiting area. Finding a corner where they could have privacy, they sat down and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. This is insane, you know that, right? We've known each other for a week. Most of that time has been spent pretending to be something we're not. Pretending with you has felt more real than any actual relationship I've had in the past 4 years, Dominic said. I know it's fast. I know it's complicated. But Sophie, I meant what I said in the car. I'm falling for you and I don't want to fight it anymore. Sophie's hands were shaking. What happens after the week is up? After the contract ends? That's up to you, Dominic said. We could let this end as planned. Go our separate ways, pretend this was all just business. Or we could see where this goes. Actually date. Get to know each other for real, without contracts or performances or timelines. And if it doesn't work out, if we try this and it falls apart? Dominic took her hands in his. Then at least we'll know we tried. At least we gave ourselves a chance instead of always wondering what if. Sophie looked into his eyes and saw vulnerability there, and hope and fear. He was taking a risk on her, this man who had built his life around control and safety. He was offering her something real, something that terrified them both. Okay, Sophie whispered. Let's try. Let's see what happens when we stop pretending. Dominic pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Sophie felt something settle in her chest. This was crazy and terrifying and moved way too fast, but it also felt right in a way that nothing else in her life had felt in a very long time. They still had 6 days left on the contract. 6 days of public appearances and maintaining the illusion of a marriage. But now the illusion had a chance of becoming real, and that possibility, terrifying as it was, felt like the beginning of something that could change both their lives forever. The next few days passed in a strange duality that Sophie struggled to navigate. On one hand, there were the public appearances, the carefully orchestrated events where she and Dominic played the role of newlyweds for an audience that watched their every move. On the other hand, there were the private moments, stolen conversations in cars between events, quiet dinners where they actually talked and learned about each other, touches that lingered longer than necessary and looked that said more than words ever could. The second event was a cocktail reception at the Chicago Art Institute, a fundraiser for arts education programs. Sophie found herself genuinely enjoying the evening, discussing the paintings with other guests and even making connections with people who shared her passion for creativity and expression. Dominic stayed close to her side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, and several times Sophie caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. "You're a natural at this," he murmured during a quiet moment, his lips close to her ear. Half the people here think you've been part of this world your entire life. I'm just being myself, Sophie replied. Turns out that's easier than trying to be someone I'm not. That's exactly why I chose you, Dominic said, and the intensity in his eyes made Sophie's breath catch. They were interrupted by James Chen, the board member from the first dinner, who approached with a concerned expression. Dominic, I need a word. Privately. Dominic's expression shifted immediately from warm to guarded. Can it wait until Monday? I'm afraid not. It's about the merger discussions with Hartwell Group. There have been some developments. Sophie saw tension flood Dominic's body. I'll just be a moment, he told her, squeezing her hand before following James to a quieter corner of the gallery. Left alone, Sophie wandered through the exhibition, admiring the artwork and trying not to worry about the serious conversation Dominic was having. She was so absorbed in a particularly beautiful landscape painting that she didn't notice someone approaching until a familiar voice made her stiffen. Enjoying the art, or just counting the minutes until you can drop the act? Sophie turned to find Victoria standing there, a glass of champagne in hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Victoria, I didn't realize you would be here tonight. I'm on the board of this organization, Victoria said. Unlike you, I actually belong in these circles. I wasn't plucked out of a diner like some kind of Cinderella fantasy. Sophie took a deep breath, reminding herself of what Dominic had said about not letting Victoria get under her skin. If you'll excuse me, I should find my husband. Oh, I don't think so. Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. We need to have a conversation, you and I, about what you're really doing here. I don't know what you mean. Please, do you really expect anyone to believe that Dominic Blackwell, who hasn't had a serious relationship since Elizabeth died, suddenly fell madly in love with a waitress and married her in secret? This whole thing reeks of desperation and deception. Sophie's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. What Dominic and I have is none of your business. It becomes my business when it affects Blackwell Industries. My father has significant investments in that company, and I won't stand by and watch Dominic make reckless decisions because he's trying to prove something to the board. Reckless decisions. He married me. How is that reckless? Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. You really don't know, do you? The board has been pressuring Dominic to settle down for months. They think he's too unpredictable, too focused on expansion and risk-taking. A wife makes him appear stable, responsible, ready to build a legacy. This marriage is nothing but a strategic move to secure his position. Sophie felt like she'd been slapped. Was that what this was really about? Had Dominic's confession of feelings been just another layer of manipulation? I can see I've given you something to think about, Victoria said with satisfaction. Here's some free advice. Take the money you're getting from whatever arrangement you have with him and walk away before you get hurt. Men like Dominic don't fall in love with women like you. They use them. Before Sophie could respond, Victoria walked away, leaving her standing alone in the gallery with doubt eating away at her newfound happiness. When Dominic returned a few minutes later, his expression was troubled. Sorry about that. Board politics. Nothing for you to worry about. But Sophie was worrying. She studied his face, trying to see past the careful mask he wore so well. Dominic, can I ask you something? Of course. The board, they've been pressuring you about your personal life, haven't they? About settling down, getting married? Dominic's expression shuttered immediately. Who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true? He was quiet for a long moment, and Sophie felt her heart sinking. Yes, he said finally. It's true. They've been concerned about my commitment to building a lasting legacy for the company. But Sophie, that's not why I asked you to do this. Or rather, it was part of the reason initially, but it's not anymore. How am I supposed to know what's real and what's part of the performance? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria said this whole thing is just a strategic move to secure your position. Victoria is bitter and vindictive, and she's trying to poison what we have, Dominic said firmly. He took both of Sophie's hands in his. Yes, the board's pressure was part of my motivation for creating this arrangement. But what I feel for you, that's real. What's happening between us, that's real. Sophie wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe that the connection they had built over the past week was genuine. But doubt had taken root, and she couldn't shake Victoria's words from her mind. The rest of the evening was strained. They maintained their public facade, smiling and chatting with guests, but Sophie could feel the distance growing between them. In the car ride home they sat in silence, the easy intimacy of previous nights replaced by uncertainty. "Talk to me," Dominic said finally. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking that I don't know what's real anymore," Sophie admitted. "A week ago I was serving coffee in a diner. Now I'm wearing designer dresses and pretending to be married to a billionaire. Except somewhere along the way it stopped feeling like pretending. And I don't know if that's because something real is happening or because I'm just playing my part too well." "It's real," Dominic insisted. "Sophie, what I feel for you is the most real thing in my life right now. But how can I know that? How can either of us know that when our entire relationship is built on a contract and a lie?" Dominic had no answer for that, and the silence that followed felt like a chasm opening between them. The third event was the yacht party on Lake Michigan, scheduled for the following evening. Sophie almost called Catherine that morning to say she couldn't do it, that she needed time to think, to figure out what was real and what was performance. But then she thought about the money, about Tyler's medical bills, about the contract she had signed. She had agreed to 7 days, and she would see it through regardless of her emotional confusion. The yacht was massive, a floating palace that made Sophie feel like she had stepped into a movie. There were easily 100 guests, all dressed in elegant summer attire, drinking champagne and enjoying the views of the Chicago skyline as the sun set over the lake. Dominic was different tonight. More reserved, more careful. He stayed close to her, but didn't touch her as freely as he had at previous events. Sophie couldn't tell if he was respecting her need for space, or if he was pulling back emotionally. About an hour into the party, Catherine appeared at Sophie's side. "Shall we need to talk, privately?" They moved to a quiet corner of the deck away from the other guests. Catherine's expression was serious, almost worried. "There's a situation developing. Someone has been leaking information to the press about Dominic's personal life. Details that only people very close to him would know." Sophie's stomach dropped. "What kind of details?" "Details about the timing of your marriage, about the fact that it was very sudden and very private. There's going to be a story published tomorrow questioning the legitimacy of the relationship, suggesting it might be some kind of arrangement rather than a real marriage." "Oh God," Sophie whispered. "What does this mean?" "It means we need to be extra careful tonight. There are reporters who managed to get onto the guest list, and they'll be watching for any sign of discord between you and Dominic. Whatever personal issues you two are dealing with, you need to put them aside for tonight." Sophie nodded, feeling sick. Who would leak information like that? Catherine's expression darkened. "We're still investigating, but we have suspicions. Someone on the board, someone who wants to undermine Dominic's position." As if summoned by their conversation, James Chen appeared, his expression grave. "Catherine, we have a problem. Marcus Blackwell just arrived and he's brought a lawyer with him." "Marcus?" Sophie asked. "Dominic's uncle?" "Yes," Catherine said. "And if he's here with a lawyer, it's not a social call." They found Dominic on the upper deck, and the moment Sophie saw his face, she knew something was very wrong. Standing with him was an older man who bore a strong resemblance to Dominic. But where Dominic's features suggested strength and determination, this man's face was twisted with bitterness and barely concealed anger. "Sophie," Dominic said, his voice tight, "this is my uncle, Marcus Blackwell." Marcus looked Sophie up and down with undisguised contempt. "So this is the woman you've been passing off as your wife?" "I have to hand it to you, Dominic, she certainly looks the part." "Watch your tone," Dominic warned, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or what? You'll have me removed from my own family's company?" "Oh wait, you've been trying to do that for months." Marcus turned to the lawyer standing beside him. "Show him." The lawyer handed Dominic a stack of documents. As Dominic read through them, Sophie saw his expression shift from anger to something that looked almost like devastation. "What is this?" Dominic asked, his voice hollow. "Legal documentation proving that your marriage is a sham," Marcus said with satisfaction. "We have proof of the contract, proof of payment, proof that this entire relationship is nothing but a fabrication designed to deceive the board and the investors." Sophie felt like she couldn't breathe. "How did you get that information?" Marcus smiled, and it was the cruelest expression Sophie had ever seen. Let's just say I have resources and I'm not afraid to use them. This marriage is fraudulent, which means Dominic has been lying to the board and to our investors. That's grounds for removal as CEO, possibly even criminal charges for fraud. You can't do this, Dominic said, but Sophie could hear the defeat in his voice. I already have. The board is meeting tomorrow morning for an emergency session. By this time tomorrow you'll be out, and I'll finally have control of the company that should have been mine in the first place. Catherine stepped forward. Marcus, think about what you're doing. This will destroy the company's reputation, tank the stock price. You'll hurt yourself as much as Dominic. It's worth it to finally put him in his place, Marcus said. My brother always favored Dominic over me, gave him everything while I had to fight for scraps. Well, not anymore. This ends tomorrow. He walked away, the lawyer following, leaving Dominic standing there with the documents in his hands. Sophie watched as something crumbled in his expression, all the careful control he maintained falling away to reveal raw pain beneath. I'm sorry, Sophie said quietly. This is my fault. I should never have agreed to this. Dominic looked at her, and the emptiness in his eyes made her want to cry. No, this is on me. I created this situation. I thought I could manipulate the circumstances, control the outcome. I was wrong. What happens now? Now I lose everything I've worked for. The company, my reputation, possibly my freedom if Marcus decides to pursue fraud charges. He looked down at the documents. And I deserve it, for thinking I could build something real on a foundation of lies. It wasn't all lies, Sophie said, reaching for his hand. What we felt, what we were starting to build, that was real. Dominic pulled his hand away gently. Was it? Or was that just part of the performance too? I don't even know anymore. The words cut deeper than Sophie expected. So that's it? You're just giving up. What choice do I have? Marcus has evidence. He has proof. There's nothing I can do to fight this. Sophie felt anger rising in her chest, burning away the fear and uncertainty. That's not the Dominic I've gotten to know. The man I've spent this week with, he's a fighter. He doesn't give up just because things get difficult. You don't understand what's at stake here. Then explain it to me. Stop treating me like I'm just some prop in your life and actually talk to me. Dominic's control finally snapped. You want to know what's at stake? Everything. The company my father built, the legacy of my family, the livelihoods of thousands of employees who depend on Blackwell Industries for their income. If Marcus takes over, he'll tear it all apart, sell it off piece by piece to the highest bidder. And I brought this on myself by thinking I could fake a marriage and somehow make it real through sheer force of will. It is real, Sophie said, her voice breaking. Maybe it started as a lie, but what I feel for you, that's not fake. I love you, Dominic. And I think you love me too, even if you're too scared to admit it. The words hung in the air between them, and Sophie saw something shift in Dominic's expression. You love me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Sophie said simply. I know it's crazy and irrational and makes no sense given the circumstances, but yes, I love you. Dominic pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I love you too, he said against her hair. God help me, I love you too, and that's why I can't let you go down with me when this all falls apart. I'm not going anywhere, Sophie said fiercely. We're in this together, remember? For better or worse, that's what marriage vows mean. But we're not really married. Sophie pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. Then let's make it real. Actually real. We can go to a courthouse tomorrow, make it legal, make it true. Then Marcus can't claim it's fraudulent because it won't be. Dominic stared at her like she had lost her mind. You can't be serious. You want to legally marry me right now in the middle of all this chaos? Why not? You said yourself that what we feel is real. So let's stop pretending and commit to it for real. Sophie, if you marry me, you'll be tied to whatever consequences come from this. If I'm charged with fraud, if I lose everything, you'll be caught up in that. I know, Sophie said, and I don't care. Because the only thing that scares me more than all of that is losing you. Dominic kissed her then, a kiss that was desperate and tender and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Okay, he said, let's do it. Let's make this real. Catherine, who had been standing quietly nearby, cleared her throat. I hate to interrupt, but we have a more immediate problem. The party is still going on, there are reporters here, and Marcus just dropped a bomb that's going to explode tomorrow. We need a strategy. Dominic's expression hardened with determination. You're right. If Marcus wants a fight, we'll give him one. But we do it on our terms. Over the next hour, they crafted a plan. They would address the situation head-on, call a press conference before Marcus could control the narrative. They would admit that yes, the marriage had started as an arrangement, but that it had evolved into something real. They would present evidence of their genuine feelings, their decision to make the marriage legal and permanent. It's risky, Catherine warned. The public doesn't always respond well to this kind of honesty, and the board might still vote to remove you. Then at least I'll go down fighting, Dominic said, and telling the truth. The press conference was scheduled for the next morning in the lobby of Blackwell Industries. Sophie barely slept that night, rehearsing what she would say, trying to prepare herself for the scrutiny and judgment that was coming. When morning arrived, she and Dominic stood together in front of a room full of reporters, cameras flashing, questions being shouted. Dominic raised his hand for silence. I've called this conference to address rumors that have been circulating about my recent marriage, he began, his voice steady and strong. It's true that my relationship with Sophie Morgan began as a contractual arrangement. I needed someone to pose as my wife for business purposes, and she needed financial security. What we didn't anticipate was that somewhere in the process of pretending to care for each other, we would actually fall in love. The room erupted in questions, but Dominic continued. I'm not proud of the deception. I should have been honest with the board and with our investors from the beginning. But I am proud of what Sophie and I have built together. Yesterday we made the decision to make our marriage legally binding. No more pretense, no more contracts. Just two people who chose each other, despite the complicated circumstances that brought us together. Sophie stepped forward, her heart pounding. I know this all sounds like something out of a movie. A waitress marrying a billionaire after knowing him for a week. But love doesn't always follow a logical timeline or an appropriate narrative. Sometimes it just happens, even when you're not looking for it, even when it's inconvenient and messy and complicated. A reporter shouted a question. Miss Morgan, did you marry Mr. Blackwell for his money? Initially, yes, Sophie answered honestly. I had medical bills for my brother that I couldn't pay. When Dominic offered me a way to solve that problem, I took it. But I stayed because I fell in love with him, and I'm making this marriage real because I want to spend my life with him, regardless of whether he's a CEO or has a single dollar to his name. Another reporter, Mr. Blackwell, is it true that your uncle is trying to remove you as CEO? My uncle Marcus has never agreed with my vision for Blackwell Industries, Dominic said carefully. He's using my personal choices as ammunition to challenge my leadership. The board will meet today to discuss the matter, and I'll accept whatever decision they make. But I want to be clear. I regret the deception, but I don't regret Sophie. She's the best decision I've ever made. The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, with both Sophie and Dominic answering questions as honestly as they could. When it was finally over, they retreated to Dominic's office to wait for the board's decision. Catherine brought them coffee and updates every few minutes. The board had been meeting for hours. Debate was heated. Marcus was pushing hard for Dominic's removal, but several board members were defending him. It could go either way, Catherine said. We just have to wait. Sophie sat beside Dominic on the couch in his office, their hands clasped together. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out, she said. You keep saying that, Dominic replied with a small smile. Like you actually believe it. I do believe it, because I've spent my whole adult life figuring things out, making impossible situations work. And now I have you to help me. We're stronger together than we are apart. Dominic kissed her softly. How did I get so lucky? You walked into a diner on a rainy night and took a chance on a stranger. Best decision I ever made. At 4 o'clock, Catherine burst into the office, her face flushed. The board has reached a decision. They followed her to the boardroom where the full board was assembled. James Chen stood at the head of the table, his expression grave. Dominic, the board has spent considerable time discussing your situation and your fitness. To continue as CEO of Blackwell Industries, James began. What you did, creating a fraudulent marriage for business purposes, showed poor judgment and a lack of integrity. Sophie felt Dominic tense beside her, preparing for the worst. However, James continued, we also recognize that you've taken responsibility for your actions. You've been honest about your mistakes, and you've demonstrated that what started as a deception has evolved into a genuine commitment. More importantly, under your leadership, this company has grown exponentially. You've made smart decisions, taken calculated risks, and always put the best interests of our employees and shareholders first. James paused, looking around the room. The vote was close, but the majority has decided to retain you as CEO, with the understanding that this kind of deception can never happen again. You're being given a second chance, Dominic. Don't waste it. Relief flooded through Sophie so intensely she felt dizzy. Dominic squeezed her hand, and when she looked at him, she saw tears in his eyes. Thank you, Dominic said, his voice rough with emotion. I won't let you down. Marcus Blackwell stood up, his face red with fury. This is a mistake. You're all making a terrible mistake. The decision has been made, Marcus, James said firmly. If you can't accept it, you're welcome to resign from the board. Marcus stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. But Sophie barely noticed. She was too busy processing the fact that they had won, that Dominic had been given another chance, that their future was still possible. That evening, Sophie and Dominic went to the courthouse and made their marriage legal. It wasn't the romantic ceremony most people dreamed of, just a simple civil service with Catherine and Robert as witnesses. But when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, and Dominic kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache, Sophie knew it was more meaningful than any elaborate wedding could have been. The final event of their original contract was the charity gala, now just 2 days away. But everything had changed. They weren't pretending anymore. They were an actual married couple, navigating the early days of a real relationship that had been forged in the strangest of circumstances. The gala was everything Sophie had imagined, and more. Held at one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels, it was an evening of elegance and philanthropy, with hundreds of Chicago's elite in attendance. Sophie wore a gown that Marcus had selected, a stunning creation in emerald green that made her feel like royalty. But the most wonderful part of the evening was dancing with Dominic, being held in his arms as they moved across the dance floor, no longer worried about maintaining a performance. This was real. They were real. Happy? Dominic murmured in her ear. Deliriously, Sophie replied, although I keep waiting for someone to pinch me and wake me up from this dream. It's not a dream, Dominic said, although I understand the feeling. 2 weeks ago, I was convinced I would never feel anything for anyone again. Now I'm married to the most amazing woman I've ever met, and I can't imagine my life without her. What happens now? Sophie asked. After tonight, after the contract period is technically over. Now we start our actual life together, Dominic said. No more performances, no more pretending. Just us figuring out how to make this work. I'd like that, Sophie said, resting her head on his shoulder as they swayed to the music. Over the following weeks, Sophie and Dominic built their life together. Sophie enrolled in culinary school, finally pursuing the dream she had put aside. Dominic adjusted his work schedule to spend more time at home, learning to balance his responsibilities to the company with his commitment to his marriage. Tyler's medical bills were paid off, and with the financial pressure relieved, he was able to focus on his own recovery and return to school. It wasn't always easy. They had arguments about silly things, like whether to keep Dominic's modern downtown penthouse or buy a house with a yard. They struggled with the public attention that came with being married to someone as prominent as Dominic. There were moments when Sophie felt overwhelmed by his world, and moments when Dominic struggled to understand the simpler life she came from. But through it all, they chose each other. Every day they woke up and chose to work on their marriage, to communicate honestly, to support each other through challenges. What had started as a contract became a commitment that went deeper than any legal document. 6 months after that rainy night in the diner, Sophie stood in the kitchen of their new house, a beautiful space with professional-grade appliances where she could experiment with recipes to her heart's content. She was preparing dinner for Tyler and some friends when Dominic came home early from work, something he had started doing more often. "Smells amazing," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and kissing her neck. It's a new recipe I'm working on, Sophie said, leaning back against him. Want a taste? She offered him a spoonful, and Dominic's expression melted into pleasure. That's incredible. You're incredible. You're biased. Absolutely. But I'm also right. Sophie turned in his arms, studying his face. Do you ever regret it? The way we started, all the chaos and drama. Dominic was quiet for a moment, considering. I regret the deception. I regret putting you in a difficult position. But I don't regret where we ended up. Every choice, every mistake, every moment of doubt and fear, it all led us here. To this house, this life, this love. How could I regret that? Sophie kissed him softly. I love you. I love you too. More than I ever thought possible. As they stood in their kitchen, wrapped in each other's arms, Sophie thought about that rainy night 2 years ago, when a stranger had walked into her diner and changed her life forever. She thought about the contract, the pretending, the fear and doubt and eventual joy. She thought about how love could grow in the strangest places, under the most unlikely circumstances. What had started as 7 days of deception had become a lifetime of truth. What had begun as a business arrangement had transformed into the greatest love story of her life. And every day Sophie woke up grateful for the storm that had brought them together, for the courage to take a chance, and for the man who had seen in her something worth choosing, even when everything else in his world was falling apart.